Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Hi, everybody. This is Bob Bazanko, co-host of the Green and Red podcast, with a special show this morning we've put together because there's a lot going on, as we all know, in the news. And one of the big news stories last week, which really didn't get as much attention as it might have otherwise because so many other things are going on, was a really dramatic, let's call it, court case, a court decision in North Dakota. And so today we're going to talk with somebody who knows as much about this as anybody in the U.S., and that's investigative journalist Will Potter. Will has been on 2 or 3 times already with us as a friend of the show. Will, very well regarded, well known. I'm not going to go through your whole biography. That would take too long, but degrees from UT Austin and Johns Hopkins, published extensively in many different places, won awards, a TED Fellow, professor at the University of Michigan. I believe it was at the School of Journalism. And
Yeah, they shut down the School of Journalism, but it was in the English department. Yeah.
and you're at the University of Denver Law School now, right?
Yep. Liberal
Okay.
rights fellow.
And published extensively, best known, I think, for Green is the New Red, which is a really important book talking about how the government takes the kinds of strategies and tactics it used, like in the Cold War and against communism, and it adapts it to other groups, including terrorism. And as you know, that's the name of our podcast, right? The Green and Red podcast. So we were thinking along the same lines. And then a new book, which is coming out real soon, right?
Coming out in
Little
June.
Red Barns. Yeah. And so we would, and well, we can mention that at the end too. But to get started, so we have this case in North Dakota stemming out of the protest that occurred, over 8 years ago now. Do you want to just do like a brief backgrounder on that, how we got to this point? And just like for people, if you haven't watched it yet, we did an interview just like last week, I think, on SLAPP suits with a lawyer who works on that. So that actually fits into this too. So you might want to check that out. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I highly recommend that for folks. So
Yeah.
It was a great conversation you guys had. I checked that out as well.
Yeah.
So to give people a little bit of a crash course in this, going back to 2016, 17 with the Standing Rock protests, which now feels like ancient history in some ways, right? But this was the protests that was really led by Indigenous First Nations groups against the pipeline construction that would be desecrating some of their sacred burial grounds, also jeopardizing water. So this movement erupted that was led by Indigenous communities, but then you had environmentalists that were trying to lend a hand in that. And that's really the heart of this. Greenpeace was involved. They do trainings for nonviolent civil disobedience, and they've done this forever. And so they come in and they teach people how to do things like civil disobedience and deal with police. And their emphasis is always on nonviolence. And that's important to remember here. And anyway, as those protests were building and gaining steam, the pipeline company was obviously getting more and more upset. They brought in a heavily militarized police presence. If folks remember the images of water cannons and attack dogs being used on First Nations and environmental protesters and journalists in freezing conditions, that was the tenor of that moment, right? So there was a lot of violence that happened at Standing Rock, but it wasn't from the protesters, it's from the police and this militarized mercenary presence. But that's a long way of saying that the pipeline company fought back against this in a couple different ways over the last few years. They tried to use RICO, which is the Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organizations Act, or also known as the mob law, the law that's most known for going after the mafia. And that didn't work. As an aside, there's been a lot of attempts to use RICO against environmental groups and other protest groups in different ways. Greenpeace has had several of these suits over the years. The pipeline company, it didn't work with RICO, and so they kicked it back and filed in North Dakota. And that's really where the problems start with this case. The jury was overwhelmingly folks connected to the industry. This is in a county that, if I'm not mistaken, I wrote that down in my notes. It was 79% Trump. So they were very deliberate of picking where they filed this like backup lawsuit motion. And what folks need to know is that lawsuits like this are really called SLAPP suits because they're strategic lawsuits against public participation. The companies know that they may not win, but they're trying to tie up protesters in the courts and suck up their resources and money And that's really what happened in this case. The ruling, it was just astounding. The jury came back with a $660 million ruling against Greenpeace, saying they were part of a conspiracy to shut down the pipeline. There's all kinds of rhetoric about them being outside agitators, which as Bob goes back to the 60s and really before that even.
Yeah.
This kind of mythology of these aren't actually the authentic protesters. This is some big conspiracy that came in. And Greenpeace from the start was like, no, we're not leading this. This is our rodeo, man. Like, we're letting the people on the ground lead it. They were really on the periphery, and we're pretty open about that, but they're the one who got really hit the hardest for it. So this lawsuit and the ruling, it is just really far-reaching implications across social movements. Marty Garbus, who was one of the attorneys for Nelson Mandela, also for Václav Havel, really key international historic cases, said publicly, this is the most egregious First Amendment ruling that they've seen in contemporary U.S. history. It really is going to have ramifications for all protest movements.
Yeah, because Energy Transfer's basic argument was that by its words, Greenpeace was damaging the interest of their company. There's no allegation of anything like destruction, violence, nothing of that sort.
Nothing. And that's really important to emphasize. Not once in this whole clown car of a courtroom proceeding was there any evidence that was rolled out to try to allege that Greenpeace was involved in property destruction, sabotage, trying to train people to fight the cops, whatever kind of hysteria you want to think about. They never tried to argue it, which is mind-blowing, right? Like, they use this language in the press, but when it came to the courtroom, they never tried to argue that. And it was all about them, Greenpeace, being part of this conspiracy to shut down the pipeline. And they also used rhetoric around defamation, but the heart of this was the conspiracy argument.
Yeah.
And harassment as well.
Yeah. Where does that, we're jumping ahead. Where's it go now? I'm not aware. Can they appeal or outside of North Dakota? Because if you're in North Dakota, they've gone venue hunting and one last thing, because you do this for everybody. When you hear about these, I think one's first inclination is to almost laugh. That's absurd. That's ridiculous. And is that kind of how people approach this initially? You got to be kidding.
I tell you what, man, that's been one of the biggest challenges in my work across the kind of trajectory of it, is it does elicit that response from people. Because I think reasonable people, not radicals or activists, but just like people that just have some common sense about them, hear things like this and they're like, how does that happen? It's almost like we're leaving out key bits of information that would otherwise explain why this is warranted. And I really want to emphasize to folks, that's not the case. We're reaching this point, and we have been for a number of years, if you guys have talked about on the show, that no matter how absurd all this stuff sounds, has traction and it's actually working. And I think that's one of the most dangerous aspects of this is thinking about, like you said, where do we go from here? This is a dangerous ruling in and of itself, but it's within the context of the rise of an outright authoritarian regime in the United States that's veering and has promised roundups of protesters, promised shooting protesters, promised lawsuits against journalists and newsroom raids, and is now using social media to identify foreign nationals who have even spoken about Trump or Gaza to be on the front of the list for deportation. So I think we have to both look at this Greenpeace case as a tactic that we're going to be seeing more of, RICO, lap suits, oil and gas industry fighting back on a dying planet. And then we also have to look at this in the context of the rise of fascism. And the CEO of the pipeline company is a huge Trump supporter. Like we said, it happened in a district that was overwhelmingly Trump. These things are all connected. And it's also connected in this kind of video I put up the other day that you mentioned. We need to remember this isn't just an environmental movement issue. Like people need to get that out of their head real fast. This isn't about Greenpeace. It's not about hippies or environmentalists or even pipeline protests. This is the playbook. In that playbook, I think we're going to see accelerating across social movements as we already are right now.
Is GP in this particular case, which wasn't like, directing the events there, was it targeted just because it's so big? It's maybe the biggest environmental and we're well known. So if you can get Greenpeace, you can get anybody. Is that kind of the idea?
I think they've been explicit about that. Yeah. I think that's a really important point to remember too, that if you look at in Greenest the New Red, I talked about this, but now since the publication of that book, it's spreading further. This started the rhetoric of eco-terrorism, the rhetoric of like radical environmentalists started with people that were more radical, that were doing sabotage and property destruction. And also in their ideology were a bit more radical of like connecting this to capitalism explicitly and things like that. We're past a threshold that now is shifting towards the mainstream. And I think Greenpeace represents that. The reason that a group like that is targeted is both to defund the movement, right? Because this is one of the heavy kind of institutional voices. And it's also to disrupt the broader movement. Because if you can take down, like you said, a key player like Greenpeace, then shit, everybody is at risk, right? The local activist campaign, the more militant groups, everybody's at risk. And I think that's a valid concern right now. They're trying to bankrupt Greenpeace and also bankrupt an entire movement.
Greenpeace put out a statement yesterday or today, which is pretty assertive, pretty adamant. We're not going to take this lying down and we're going to appeal it. Going forward, what do they do? I'm not a lawyer. Is there a good chance of appeal? Can they get these cases out of North Dakota? How does this affect specifically Greenpeace? Because they're big and it's kind of a canary in a coal mine again, right? If you could get Greenpeace,
100%.
then, yeah. So
I think there's a couple of things. We need to remember that, yes, this is a really dangerous ruling. It is not done. Greenpeace has already cleared that they're appealing. As you might imagine, I don't have an enormous amount of faith in that process. And I would even go so far as to say, I think we need to break ourselves out of this spell a little bit right now of thinking that courts are going to continue to be a check or a balance or even a safeguard of this descent into fascism. And we're seeing that tested across the board. The Trump administration is deporting people in defiance of court orders. Like they're just flagrantly doing that. It's hard to say. That doesn't mean isn't resistance among judges or people that are pushing back. It doesn't mean it's not possible for Greenpeace to succeed in the appeal. But I think we also have to keep in mind, like, what happens if they don't? What happens if they can't? And I don't know. I've been thinking about this a lot the last couple of days. And really all I can say to that is that I think this is one of those moments where we have to remember that we need to be willing to go for broke. If this bankrupts Greenpeace, they still did what they needed to do. And that they showed up in the right way at Standing Rock. They utilized their skills and resources the best they could. They did all the right things. And the fact that it arrived at this point, I don't think the takeaway of that is we need to do things differently next time. I think sometimes we have to be willing to go for broke. If we throw a punch and it comes back at us tenfold, or in this case, 20-fold, the ruling is about 20 times Greenpeace's annual budget.
yeah.
And I think those are the stakes right now. We're facing a climate catastrophe. And I think this is a gut check for a lot of folks right now of what we're willing to put on the line. And unfortunately, Greenpeace is right out front in this.
Well, especially because right now we're seeing so much capitulation, right? Media, other politicians, comedians are saying, I'm going to, so you have this pervasive fear, and it's important, I think, to, even if they pay the price for it, to see what Greenpeace did. I have another question, because I know that this is like a part of what you do. And when we started talking about terrorism, I think we always have, but especially after 9/11, and that became the buzzword for everybody. And it became very politicized. And so I remember very early on, liberals were very upset. Why is that terrorism? But this isn't. And so they started using the same language. I think it was Bush's advisor, Matthew Dowd, who said, once they start using our language, we won. And I kept hearing liberals say, this is terrorism and this is terror. Why isn't this terrorism? Do you think that, in a sense, contributed to this atmosphere where you could do these terrorist enhancements on environmentalists and animal rights activists and things like what we're seeing today?
Yeah, I think this is a trap that liberals have fallen into historically, is they think that expanded state power, authoritarian power, can still be turned around to their benefit, can still be used somehow. And we saw that with the terrorism rhetoric, both in a linguistic sense, a rhetorical sense. There's a lot of times over the years, I got in arguments with folks of, we can't just say, oh, the real terrorists are X. Like, I know it's tempting and it fits our values to want to be like, the pipeline company is the terrorist because of this and this, but it does what you said. This goes into Frank Lutz's work, right? Of just like, you create the language and then exactly like you said, Bob, once that is accepted into the popular discourse, the battle is won. And so I think what I've seen in my work is how thoroughly institutionalized that rhetoric has become. It has just become the default. It used to be that raised alarms and people would try to push back and say things about who the real terrorists are. Now I don't even think it raises an eyebrow. And now, like in the Greenpeace case, we saw that it was less about rhetoric of terrorism, which is really interesting to me, and more about radicals. And that I think is a really important historic shift that we're seeing right now, that they are trying to use this case as a bridge between the mainstream, the NGOs, the international NGOs like Greenpeace, and this boogeyman of the radical, right? And the more they're able to do that, it's going to open the gateway to going after, frankly, everybody.
Yeah, which we're seeing right now, which is actually a good point, right? What's happening in North Dakota involves this pipeline, but what we're seeing right now is way bigger than that. When we talked a couple months ago, we discussed this as well. The situation is getting more intense by the day. One thing that, and this reminds me of in particular, is Cop City, because they're facing similar charges. Were they RICO'd in Cop City?
They were RICO'd as well.
They were RICO'd in Cop City.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is again for a nonviolent protest. The police actually murdered one of the activists there. They're just violate left and right, just basic due process and things like that. Is there much of a pushback on these things? What are people doing?
That's a great question. There is pushback. There's always pushback.
Yeah.
I feel the sense I have right now is that people are just in a state of being stunned. And I think that's goes back to Bannon, the Trump administration's entire strategy explicitly.
It's explicit. Yeah.
Flood the
I keep
zone,
wondering why they're
right?
so shocked, because they've been telegraphing this for years.
And that's what I'm struggling to process right now too. But that being said, like we and many others have been saying this is the direction we're going for years. And I don't know about you, I feel this right now. I'm just like stunned. I'm not surprised, but it's still like completely disorienting. It feels like you really got a right hook to the jaw.
Oh, yeah.
It's just what is happening? And I think they're just trying to keep up that pace because we frankly need to realize we don't have a popular movement and structure in place for the level of resistance that's required right now. And I say that not to be negative, just an honest assessment of Anthony Romero of the ACLU. I thought had a good statement the other day talking about the Trump administration's refusal to even acknowledge the legitimacy of the judiciary anymore. And somebody asked him, like, where do we go from here? And he's like, we have to shut the entire country down. And that's what we have to do. And the question is, how do we organize and mobilize quickly enough to do things like that? Because frankly, I'm at the point that I think people need to realize that we're in the matter of months within the year before this ship has sailed. They're trying to shut and really tear down the entire democratic structure in a very short amount of time. So it's really scary. I don't know the answer to it. I feel like this urgency that we need to be doing everything we can, pushing that red line to shut this down, but it also feels like we're stunned and don't know how to do it.
Something I've been playing with. I think COVID, like this country's always been pretty repressive, but COVID, I think, brought it up to a brand new level, because I was actually stunned by like people having like violent protests over wearing a mask and stuff like that. So we've moved in that direction, and the state has immense power. More and more, there's very little. Schumer keeps saying next time, or when he does this, or what do you say yesterday when Trump rejects a court ruling? I was like, well, he's done that many times already. I don't know when, but my point is, on the other hand, we always look for hope, right? And we're seeing pretty significant support for Mahmoud Khalil and others who have been just like literally kidnapped and abducted. And then what's really, I think, in some ways, maybe even inspiring, is what's going on with regard to Tesla and Musk. They can be, I'm assuming these are organic, they just spontaneous. I'm sure there are groups associated with it, but they came out pretty quickly. They came up pretty quickly.
It feels that way.
Yeah.
And that I think I'm drawing frankly, a lot of hope from right now that like, especially in the worlds we operate in, you think about social movements and organizing, and we forget how much potential there is of just the organic nature of when we all as a culture feel like we've just gone too far and crossed a threshold. And I see that in the Mahmoud Khalil, just snatched up off the street with the green card for nonviolent protest, pregnant wife. You can't get more obscene than that, but also with the Tesla vandalism and destruction. I do not think that this is at all connected to the Earth Liberation Front, like it might have been in the 90s or early 2000s or Earth First. This feels like people that are seeing the authoritarian slide that we're
People
in
hate
right
Elon
now.
Musk. Yeah,
They hate Elon Musk, and
Elon Musk.
but also speaks to we've had so many debates about tactics in the environmental movement over the years, and at the end of the day, I think the general public doesn't care about like property destruction. To me, this is a reminder of the tactics aren't what caused this repression. The efficacy of these movements caused the repression. And so that's why now you have Trump trying to talk about deporting Tesla vandals to other countries to lock up in supermax prisons and label as terrorists, right? Like it has nothing to do with the vandalism. They're scared by that. And they're scared that this is a spontaneous, unruly movement that is going straight at corporate profits.
Yeah, Bondi today, the attorney general kind of reiterated, we're coming after these people and we believe in law and order and all this shit. And again, I think that really ties into this because I've noticed like some of the more establishment things. I forget it was like Foreign Affairs or Wall Street Journal today talking to an esteemed specialist who said, oh, yes, this is absolutely terrorism. There's that word again. So with Tesla, right? And so they're playing it into that again. But I think what's striking is that there is a significant level. Luigi Mangione, this guy became a folk hero, right? And so, yeah, there is like this somebody once told me it was James Baldwin. I've never confirmed it, but I always read it anyway. Something along the lines of beneath the pavement, that's where the truth lies. And that's, I think, what we're seeing, because we're not talking about this, but underneath, there's a lot of people who are really pissed off and tired of this. And it's just hard because the people who run the country won't get out of the way. And then you have, the Democratic Party, which people like Slick Gavin Newsom are playing into these Republican ideas as well. So we're on our own, aren't we?
Yeah, I have the line I've heard more often than anything else in my career doing crisis journalism is no one is coming. I've heard it in war zones. I've heard it after natural disasters. I've heard it from protesters and lawyers. This idea that there's a moment where we realize, oh, someone's not going to swoop in and save us and fix us. And I think we're reaching that point as a country that we're realizing like, okay, the rest of the world is realizing like they have to organize for Ukraine without us. They have to deal with foreign aid without. I think people are starting to realize that we have to protect us. We have to take care of this. And there's an enormous amount of potential in that. Like, I don't know quite how to process it, because if you look at those moments in history, it's really hard to explain why things suddenly shift into, I'll even go so far as to say like revolutionary potential of a historical moment. It's not clear. Like, I don't know, like what is the bridge too far? Is it one additional court ruling? Is it one more person snatched up off the street? Is it 1,000 more? But whatever it is, it's just this like bubbling up that I think we are seeing it right now. Like, shoot, even in Colorado, the Bernie and AOC rallies they're doing, then you can say what you will about that of both of them, if they're going far enough or what they're doing. But 30,000 people.
Yeah,
And,
no,
so I think people are hungry for it, hungry for an outlet to actually do something right now.
I've seen a lot of people who describe themselves as very radical and extremists who are like making fun of or dismissing what's happening now with Sanders and AOC. But no, I agree. I think it's important. Not that they're
people
they're not going
to
to lead the revolution, but yeah, they're doing something. They're doing something, which obviously Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and these people are. Let me ask you something. I don't know if you've ever really thought about this or talked about it, but I'm sure you've thought about it, but it's in your wheelhouse. And that's what RFK is doing right now, because in a lot of ways, he's more dangerous, I think, than anybody right now in that administration, because he's like getting people killed. And
Yep.
like because this does touch on things like the food supply and the environment. And I think you and I will criticize the food supply as well. We're not going to defend big ag and big pharma, but RFK, I think, is a different kind of cat. What are you seeing? Do you think there's a potential there for people to say, hey, we can't do this anymore. We've got to stand up to this guy?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because I think RFK is, people are sleeping on it a little bit of how
Yeah.
dangerous this man is. And even going so far as I'm seeing folks in some circles think that this is an opportunity that you can cozy up to this dude, because he's really what people like RFK and this entire administration is doing is they're taking the real frustrations and distrust that people have for things like big ag or the medical system or government, and then weaponizing it and manipulating it and turning it into something completely batshit crazy to push their agenda. And there's a few different ways of looking at it, but the way I see that is that the reason he's been able to be successful is there is that undercurrent of frustration and anxiety and demand for change. It's this, that people are being like misdirected through all of his conspiracy theories and anti-vaxxer nonsense and everything else. And so I think we can't lose sight of that I think a lot of the folks that are falling for that rhetoric are getting there from a place of skepticism and criticism, and maybe that can be turned into a healthier dynamic. But I think we do need to remember that, dude, especially in the animal protection movement, I'm seeing some groups trying to like go after low hanging fruit wherever they can with RFK or with this administration. And that's just a recipe for suicide. There is no way that authoritarianism is going to be good for animals or the environment or our food supply. There's no possible outcome that this works out in our favor. So as tempting as it might be to jump on the conspiracy theory bandwagon and try to profit from it, it's not going to get us anywhere.
Yeah. I feel about conspiracies. One thing that struck me, it's not like I try not to be an I told you, but for decades, people, and I'm a little older than you, and I'm sure you've been around people saying the same thing. Well, for decades, we've been talking about the news sucks. We didn't use the phrase fake news, but we talked about that. And we talked about elitism, and we talked about working class people and NAFTA and all these kinds of things, the food supply. And somehow the liberals just beat the shit out of us, and the right wing stole all these issues, and they don't believe in any of them. They're not, we were on top of that stuff, and it's just really maddening, right? That,
Well, and especially look at the press.
Yeah.
How that's another example of what we were just talking about. There's legitimacy to these critiques. 100%. People are frustrated with the state of the news. It's the journalism today has not been delivering what we need for a healthy, critical society. But rather than looking at the structures that are in place and media ownership and corporate ownership and control of the news and how that limits journalists and how it's a push for profit rather than providing service and community, all of that critique has been lost in this like fake news simplification.
Yeah.
And I think it's another one of those examples, but that if we don't speak honestly and directly and make people uncomfortable sometimes with these conversations, the right's going to swoop in and simplify it and reduce it to something that they can weaponize for their benefit instead.
Yeah. This is so great talking to you all the time, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but
No, that's great, man.
you have a new book coming out.
I do. Yeah.
And this isn't in any way to dismiss what I think what you do is incredibly important. When you're dealing with the topics you do, it's always timely. That was like everything you do is timely because fucking crisis doesn't go away, right? It just keeps getting worse. It's from farm to Little Red Farms,
Little Red Barns.
Little Red Barns, from farm to fable.
Farm
Right?
to fable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I should have written it down. I relied on my memory.
No, it's okay.
But,
Yeah, no, it's a surreal. I laughed when you brought it up because it's just, I got a book coming out. There's got a lot of feelings about this right now.
I know everything you do is timely. I didn't like you have great timing, but unfortunately, like the fucking thing never goes away.
It never goes away, and it's also all of this is coalescing in a way that I worked on that book for many years,
Yeah,
and it started as an investigation of factory farms, but then is this conversation in a nutshell. It's connecting the dots to the larger tactics of political repression that have spread around the world, and how also this issue is connected to the rise of fascism globally. So it's one of those things where it feels like, I would always tell my journalism students, sometimes the best time to be a journalist is also the worst time to be a journalist. And that's how it feels right now. That, yeah, everything is very timely. This is straight out of the headlines, but it feels a little surreal. It's like, I feel like I've been trying to make a warning that now is, I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to do right now.
Yeah.
It's not a time for warnings anymore. Now is a time of getting to the barricades and fighting back.
Yeah. So your books are available everywhere. The next one isn't out yet, right? It's a few months away still. Or?
Yeah, and I'll make the shameless plug for pre-orders. It comes out June 24th. The books will ship before that. But yeah, if people are interested in this, if anybody could help out with the pre-orders, it's a huge help because it helps establish this as something that people are talking about. But after it comes out, I'll be doing speaking events and touring a bit, and hopefully talking to you guys again about it. So
Absolutely. And maybe we'll cross paths. That would be great.
yeah, that'd be great.
Give us a few reasons not to panic. I put it on you because I got nothing.
Yeah, I was going to say, I appreciate
nothing.
that, Bob. Thanks for looking out. And, thanks for getting towards the end with the softball questions.
This is the kind of day where after you think of the world, you go out on your triumph. You just ride.
I think, but that is what I do. I mean, there's a lot of that. I'm struggling with it because it's both, think we need to panic, but I think we need to acknowledge that the fear that we feel and or even the panic or anxiety is valid. So for folks that are listening to this, it really is that bad. This is not a Chicken Little. This is not a inflating or hyperbole. It is that bad. The stakes are that high right now. And I think we look at that, and if we honestly confront that reality, the other things that we're dealing with, I think, fall more into place, if that makes sense. I think there's something to be said for these moments in history where it feels like everything is coalescing and this like monstrosity that we don't know how to deal with. In those moments, other types or some types of social change just become much more feasible because all of a sudden it like recalibrates us of what's at stake and what our other problems are that we're dealing with. And so that gives me a degree of hope. I guess I'm saying this out loud because I'm trying to do it personally too, of trying to remember like, all right, what I'm seeing is that bad. I have a reason to be concerned about my safety on things like book tour. But at the same time, it puts our blinders on of the work that needs to be done and the stuff that we also should not be focused on right now. And to me, that's things like infighting among social movements, trying to tear each other down, to like purity politics of thinking like our approach through whatever scholarship is more sound than this. And I think the time for that is done right now. This is a time where we realize who's more closely aligned with us and who the real opposition is. And I think if we keep that front and center, that's how we get through this and realizing like who our people are and who the real opposition are, the people trying to destroy basic human rights, civil liberties, and democracy itself.
I've been very critical of like Sanders and AOC, but I'm glad they're doing this. Somebody's got to do it. I'm not the biggest fan of a lot of the mainstream unions. They need to do this. Something else I've been doing media lately and teaching and everything. And one thing that I think is important is, and one thing I've stressed is that there's a long history of this in the United States. I mean, Trump, because a lot of liberals are now like discovering this because of Trump. This has been going on forever and it's bipartisan. And I think it's important for people to understand just like how ingrained. I keep using the H. Rap Brown's line. This is violence. This is American. It's cherry pie. I think people need to understand it. But at the same time, because I try not to get hysterical or anything, but this is bad. And there are some uber left people call themselves lefties. I don't know what they are, who they're dismissing it. No, this is really bad. It really is. And
no, I say, I was just going to say, this has been my wheelhouse for my whole career. And I think I've been able to approach it with a level head throughout and tried to resist hyperbole or adjectives or I don't want to rile people. cry wolf, all that kind of thing. And I will say every drop of blood in my body is saying that this is as bad as it feels.
No, I agree.
Right. And the scholars of fascism are all saying that, scholars of human rights globally. And so I think it speaks to, I had a journalism professor way back who would always say, when you don't know what to do, you have to do something. And that's just one of the truisms of this moment, that it feels like, oh my God, we don't know what we can possibly do against these threats, but we have to move. Like, we can't just be frozen in space. And so even if we take actions that aren't the best or the most strategic or the most effective, that's okay. I'm a really big proponent right now of just like, we have to get out there and be doing something, even if that's just as a kind of a coping mechanism to personally help you navigate these times, to be out there organizing a protest or a potluck or a community event or whatever it is you want to do. Just the action, I feel like something happens where we can kick ourselves into gear, and then other ideas come from that, other organizing. And so I feel it, man. I feel frozen a lot of these days too, especially doing the stuff we do, teaching, writing books, reading books. It just feels, what is the place for that in this world right now? But we just have to keep contributing wherever we can and keep moving.
Yeah. One thing I think it's important is it's not, I used to say this all the time, less so now. It's not 1954 anymore, right? We don't have the same mechanisms like you would see at the beginning of the civil rights movement. It's just in history, but we're not that far away either from it. And that's the part that's really terrifying. And the other part that I think is here is going up to 1954, you have a more or less of a progression, right? It wasn't like African Americans were equal and then it was taken away and then they got it back. Now what we're doing is we're going back fundamental things, whether it be civil rights or women's right to choose or whatever. And that's the part I think that people have to understand. That's scary because when you start backsliding and taking away things that you had accepted, then you're in a different world. And that's the part I think we're really.
Well, and that's where, like, the new book, that this idea of the little red barns, that's what that's referring to. We have to remember that fascists always mythologize the past. It's never about moving forward or expanding compassion, expanding rights. It's always going back to this mythical past and rewriting history. And that's what we're seeing, where they've had such effective attacks on education and the press, book bans, that there isn't a cultural understanding of how far we've come and how easy it is to go backwards at the same time. I will say, though, as a slightly positive spin or something to layer on top of that, like when we talk about protest movements, it's easy to think of in the 60s of this heyday of activism, right? Or you think about resistance movements globally, and it's easy to build them up and think we don't have that right now, or it's not the same. And the movements are different right now, but what we do have is such a more robust understanding of how these mechanisms like repression work. Like, we've seen it develop over history and repeatedly in contemporary history. And I think we need to remember that. Like, we might feel weak right now, or we might not feel like we don't have millions out in the street, so we don't have X, Y, or Z that we need. But at the same time, I think there is a deep entrenched cultural understanding of what we're losing. And I think we have to gravitate to that and give an outlet for that right now.
Another part, and you're also like on a university, there was a time I don't think either of us are naive about university administrators. They're part of this kind of neoliberal state too, and they're not very good at it. I would say like universities are badly run corporations, but I think, I don't know, I'm actually somewhat surprised by the total cave in. You don't expect much from a place like Columbia, but in Texas, where, you went to school there. I forget the name of it. I think it's SB 37. Essentially, the state's taking over university curriculums as well. So they would have, essentially, the Board of Regents would create a committee. They would look at your syllabus. They would come to class and evaluate you and talk to students and look at student reviews and all that kind of stuff. And they're also setting up a snitch hotline for students to complain. And that's the part that, at least at some point in the past, universities would, I think more than lip service, they would actually take some of this stuff seriously. But now, all it took was just a threat by Trump, who I actually think is in many ways a paper tiger. Like, he backs down a lot as soon as people stand up to him, but we're not seeing that. I think that part's really terrifying, right? These kind of bulwarks, right? Universities or unions or community groups or the Democratic Party, allegedly, right? They're failing us. So we really are at our own.
They are failing. And I think the shared thread among that, it reminds me of kind of Schumer's capitulation as well, right? As this escalates, it's really tempting, especially from institutions like Columbia or the Democratic Party or corporations or whoever, rolling back DEI protections, to think that, well, we have to do whatever we can to keep this from getting worse, kind of thing. It's this mentality of this is the card, the hand we've been dealt. So we need to look out for whatever we can, do the best we can. And it's just such a weak, frankly, cowardly position of just accepting any scraps that fall off the table before they get swept away from us. And I think we should have learned by now that they're all going to get swept away. Like, we're not going to be able to catch those crumbs fast enough. And as soon as we do, there's going to be a next attack and a next. And so it's going to be a gut check, I think, for institutions and also for social movements of, do we actually understand that? And if we do understand it, what does the resistance to this look like right now? How hard do we fight back?
Hey, thanks. As always, the court case, I don't think it was shocking. I've talked to people in the last few months who said, I don't think anybody expected it to go out well because of what you're dealing with in North Dakota. Wasn't that's Christy Nome's state, isn't it? Or is she from South
Yeah.
Dakota?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, actually, I'm drawing a blank. I don't remember.
I don't know, but they're not much different, right?
No,
So,
it's one of those things. It's like, it's not a shock, but it's still shocking, right? And I think we need to take cases like this, realize the threat, but also the resilience of bouncing back from some of these blows, because I don't like to be doing interviews like this and have to remind people that there are more blows coming. Like, this is the strategy. This is a really big on social movements, and there are going to be others. And I think this is really a catalyzing moment that, unless we see these as what they are right now, they're going after core rights to protest and free speech. They're trying to shut all these movements down.
It's up to us. The courts aren't going to save us.
Nope.
The Democratic Party isn't going to save us. It's up to us.
No, it's up to popular movements. That's it.
It's always great talking to you. We'll definitely have
It was
you
great talking
and
to you.
again when the book is out, and we really appreciate it so much. This is Will Potter, really well-known journalist, author of Little Red Barns, forthcoming.
You good?
I got it.
Yeah.
Okay. And very well-known greenest that we read. Really appreciate it. This is Green and Red Podcast. I'm Bob Bazenko, and we'll have all the info in the show notes about how to follow us and on social media, listen to the podcast. We're on YouTube, social media platforms. And if you like it, donate a few bucks. We have a little bit of overhead. We can always use a few bucks. So we really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Will.
Thanks for talking to me, Bob. It was good talking to you today.